Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca. Thanks to our show sponsors, Farming Forward, The Wheat School, and RealAg on the Weekend. In partnership with Rolco Radio in Saskatoon, Real Agriculture is pleased to present RealAg on the Weekend with host Sean Haney. Listen live on Saturdays at 4 p.m. in Saskatchewan on 650 CKOM Saskatoon and 980 CJME Regina, or find it on Real Agriculture, on RealAg's podcast feeds, and on CJME.com and CKOM.com as a podcast download.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. Thank you so much for joining me on this. Well, it's the day after the time change, except for, of course, for our friends in Saskatchewan. It's the day before the U.S. election, and it is November. Let me tell you, where I am, it is cold and rainy and windy. It has just been kind of a miserable day. So I hope it's been better where you are. Although Kevin joins us from the West Coast, he said, no, wet and windy, kind of nasty over there as well. So sounds like maybe that's just the weather we're in for this month. Okay, quick reminder, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you took in the show. We'll get you those CEU credits. And hey, we've got 3 guests tonight, so I am super excited. Tonight's topic, we are talking fall fieldwork. That opens up the door to a couple things. Certainly, get your questions in. We're going to talk a bit of tillage. We're going to talk manure applications, some other nutrient management decisions we might have to make, and maybe some technology too. So to have tonight's conversation, let's bring them in. I've got with me tonight Curtis Cavers out of Portage Prairie, Manitoba, Glen Arnold from Ohio State University, and Christine Brown from OMAFA. I will forever pronounce it OMAFA, even though that's probably not. I'm putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable, but that's fine. Okay, now, Curtis and Glen, first times on the show. Thank you both. Curtis, I'll start with you. What keeps you busy in beautiful Portage Prairie, Manitoba?
Mostly these days working on some tillage projects, a little bit of crop residue management, and a little bit of nutrient management.
Okay. All right. And what kind of fall did Southern Manitoba enjoy?
At least around where I am, mostly dry. We started off very wet, I think. I was looking at my percent of normal rainfall for Portage here for this growing season, and I think May was like 262% of normal in May. July was 140, or June was 145% of normal, and then July and August were well below normal. So you average it out, and it's probably right on the mark.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. That's why averages don't tell us much, right? All right.
No, that's right.
Glen, we were talking just before we went live, experiencing so dry where you are, actually some fall field fires. So what kind of growing season have you had in your area?
Well, generally, we did not get started very early because we were wet in April and May. Fields finally got suitable in June, and then we really didn't get any moisture after that for the most part. Yields are better than we expected. It's a tip of the cap to the genetics that they have with corn and soybeans in the past few years and how far they've come. But generally, we've been extremely dry, and even the last 3 or 4 rain opportunities have resulted in just a scattering of showers. So, we are fighting field fires on almost a daily basis in Northwest Ohio. And today, in particular, the wind's blowing pretty good. So it's really hard to put out field fires when the wind's blowing. Yeah. And it was caused by somebody burning leaves in their backyard.
Oh, that's all right. Like lightning strikes, you can almost sort of, okay, well, it's nature. What are we going to do? But when it's somebody that just didn't control their backyard burn, it gets pretty frustrating. That is for sure. Now, Glen, for those of you who don't know and are following along, what kind of work do you do with Ohio State? What do you research? What do you look into?
Well, I primarily work with manure application. We spent a lot of time in the last 15 years or so trying to get manure utilized with growing crops. So we do a lot of side dressing of corn, top dressing of wheat, top dressing of hay between cuttings. Any place that we can find during the growing season to utilize manure, we're trying to, so that there's less of it to apply this time of year.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. And Christine Brown, of course, with OMAFA here in Ontario. And what has kept you busy this season?
We've been doing some plot work with manure side-by-sides, looking at different application rates with different commercial nitrogen rates, trying to look at efficiencies. I've had a forage project that's been on the go for the last couple of years, where we've been applying manure on a regular basis and trying to get an idea of what impact, both negatives and positives, that we get from manure on forages. And then, of course, the field days and some of the events that we're always working with.
Mm-hmm.
Always busy.
Always busy. Yeah, some of the living lab stuff that you're working on, Christine, super fascinating.
Yeah.
And if ever we can talk about forage and manure, I'm a happy girl. Let's be honest. Kevin shares, just putting things in perspective, everybody. He is on the west. Let's remember he's west, but 12 inches of rain in October. Lucky to get cover crops planted, not able to get the manure on, and some corn silage acres abandoned because the ground was still too wet. So 12 inches in October. Hi. 12 inches in July is a lot, but at least you've got a growing crop, and you've got warm days to deal with it. So one of the things we are going to talk about tonight is, of course, the plans you have for fall field work, whether that's manure, tillage, whatever, and when things like this happen, when the weather does not cooperate, what do you do, and what are some of the things you can do? So those are all up for grabs tonight. Curtis, I want to start with you in talking tillage. It's when I think of Manitoba, we don't usually think of trying to conserve moisture, usually pretty ample, but that has not been the norm in the past couple of years. And so in your work more recently, looking at perhaps conserving moisture, how has that gone in the last few years as far as the work?
It's kind of a tale of two parts of the province, I guess. Generally, you've got the Red River Valley right around Winnipeg, that's flat, heavy clay, and tends to be very very good at holding lots of moisture. Usually the problem there is excess moisture. And then the rest of Manitoba with lighter soils, variable landscapes, and that tends to be something that's more likely prone to be either dry, or at the very least it's a little more suitable to reduced or no-till, and using that as a way to conserve moisture. So if things are dry, especially if they get extremely dry and there's been a lot of tillage, especially if it's excess amount of tillage, soils can start to move, especially through wind erosion. And we haven't seen that for a number of years, so this is probably an extreme case, but I guess I'm old enough now to be able to say that it has happened and it can happen again on some of these things. It's just how frequent, widespread, or severe could it be on something like that. So a good rule of thumb, if you're not doing no-till, but you are doing some tillage and you're trying to manage your residue, is try and have at the very least 35% residue cover on most soils. If you think you've got soils that are more prone to wind erosion and things like that, then maybe have 65% residue cover as a quick and dirty rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm. Everybody loves snert in the winter,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
When the snow in the ditches is catching everybody's topsoil. Glen, what would be a typical, I hate to say it, but sort of a typical fieldwork season look like? Is fall tillage an absolute part of the rotation, or do farmers wait till spring?
I would say that we're big on fall tillage in my area of the state. A couple reasons. One, it's a very heavy clay, a lot of Paulding clay and Whiteville clays and stuff, and those used to take a long time to dry in the spring. So if you were to drive through our area, you would see field after field after field that's been fall worked and then land leveled, and it just looks like barren ground across there. And unfortunately, we don't see near as many cover crops as we'd like to see. But if they'll do that fall tillage, they'll get that ground leveled, they'll get their surface ditches in, and then the following spring, oftentimes they can just go in there and plant that in late April or early May, not have to do any spring tillage whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. So now, is the concern over something like wind erosion, is that a very real one that gets discussed, or?
Yeah, we have the brown snow just as you guys have,
Mhm.
and when we actually look at ditch water quality and water quality in our ditches and streams and places like that, usually our soil and waters tell us that the worst water quality is usually in the heavier clay soils that have been worked very fine in the fall, and they suspect it's from the wind erosion through the winter months
Right.
that causes a lot of that, and water erosion too. But
Mhm.
that's just their thoughts on it, and because economically it works out really well for farmers to do that. It's pretty hard to untrain them to do that fall tillage.
Mhm. Well, and as Mark points out, it's hard to establish a cover crop when it's really dry. It's
Mhm.
Cover crops are a great idea, but if it does not rain or if there is no soil moisture, they're not going to germinate. They're not going to grow, and so realistically, there are some limitations. Um, as well. Now, Dave's got a good question. Christine, feel free to hop in on this one as well, because you, of course, have been. We had roots, not iron. We had don't farm naked, which was the residue question. We've had lots of great taglines to go with this one. It's a good question. Dr. Dave Hooker says, does the residue cover percent depend on whether the residue is anchored or not? Christine, what say you? Does it need to be part of the soil?
I think in our area we have probably more water erosion issues than wind erosion, and there's a lot of times where if you get a big rainstorm, there will be a huge pile of residue at the area where it all ponds. So I think anchored residue is very important, especially if you've got a wheat field and you don't want it buried in corn residue.
Mhm.
Wind erosion, I don't have as much experience, but again, I think anchored is going to make a bigger difference.
Mhm. Curtis, do you agree?
Yeah, I think there was something in there in our notes somewhere back at one time saying if it's anchored, that's more effective for wind erosion, and if it's flat, then it's more effective for water erosion, or
Right.
certainly raindrop impact and things like that. So,
Right.
yeah, there's variations in cover, but it's quick and dirty saying more cover is probably better.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it brings us to, um, well, and as Glenn has shared as well, we do fall passes at times to prepare for spring. Our springs might be too wet, and therefore the fall gives us an opportunity to get some things done that perhaps when time is tight in the spring, it buys us some time in the spring. But there's of course some drawbacks, and as we've hit on, erosion can be one of those drawbacks potentially, or the weather does work against us and the things we want to do in the fall doesn't happen. Christine, maybe we'll go there on thinking about manure application, especially. Um, we do see, quite a bit of manure that goes on late in the season, but that's not, of course, always the goal. Um, how much planning should we be doing as far as should we be aiming for, say, earlier in the season and trying to avoid the fall season for manure applications, and why?
Yeah, and I think Glenn started saying that earlier on, where we have as many opportunities during the growing season to apply manure as possible, and so that means planning ahead. And so in our part of Ontario, where we're lucky enough to have a fair bit of wheat acreage, that wheat comes off in the summer, and so that gives a lot of farmers a great opportunity when the conditions are usually a little bit better to, or hopefully most times better, to apply that manure. And then there's still going to be some application that has to happen in the fall, but hopefully then the workload is spread out a bit so that we've got some good weather. And this year we've been really lucky.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that in my area at least, a good percentage of the corn is off. Almost all the soybeans are off. It's been fairly dry, so it's been perfect weather for manure application so far. Where other years, sometimes harvest doesn't happen until early December. It's been wet, and sometimes the first opportunity for manure application is sometime in December when suddenly you get a week of good weather, and that makes it pretty tough to get a lot of workload done in a quick amount of time, and to get that manure incorporated so that you don't get the nutrient runoff into the water courses.
Right. Yep, and we've got actually Glenn sent some really cool pictures of different ways that we can get that manure on there. But Mark shares in heavy clays, if we don't want water erosion after manure application. Post wheat harvest, only a growing cover crop in the fall will hold it in place. Straw residue just doesn't cut it. Glenn, you're saying yes. Yeah, expand on that one.
I was just going to say we had an unusually large amount of wheat acreage this year, which really played in well for manure application because I opened up a lot of fields, and even farmers that weren't into manure application or receiving manure, because their fields were available and we had such tremendous dry, and so it was made for good conditions to apply manure. So we had a lot of it put on fields that normally wouldn't receive. So many of our large dairies are pumped down nicely, and then our farmers who have their own buildings are hard at work after soybeans and corn came off, getting that manure out there. But yeah, I agree. We want to get a cover crop if we possibly can, because the ammonium portion of that manure is going to get away from us. We estimate at least 50% of that will get away from us in any given winter. So if we can convert that ammonium nitrogen into stems and roots and leaves, and that's an organic form of nitrogen, and that'll be a slow release over a number of years. So if you don't do it, you're going to donate it away. So I really encourage cover crops as much as possible in wheat stubble fields, and even our dairy farmers are really good about that too, because they'll harvest their silage, they'll get manure out there, then they'll get triticale or cereal rye on those fields. That'll overwinter, and that'll become feed next May or June, and then they'll plant silage corn again and repeat the whole process year after year after year.
Mm-hmm. I like the donating, Glenn. That's very sweet. We can just donate that nitrogen. I know I would like to keep that nitrogen. I don't want to donate it. So that's what we would like to do. Absolutely. Okay. So definitely a consideration. Curtis, I want to touch on the rules within different areas just quickly while we're talking about manure. That in Ontario, there are guidelines and there are rules, but we can spread through the winter. Manitoba cannot. There are different rules about spreading manure.
Yeah.
So everyone, please, pay attention to rules.
Yeah, it's going to vary from one jurisdiction to another, and I'm not necessarily up on what it is outside of Manitoba. I know in Manitoba there's no spreading on frozen soils, and for ease of defining what a frozen soil is, they just use the calendar on something like that. So from November 10th till April 10th or 15th, I believe
something
it is.
Like
so,
that. Yeah.
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 Mm-hmm.
Everybody check. Okay?
Yep.
Okay. Christine, instead, in Ontario, we just argue over whether or not it's okay to put manure out. So we have, it does, though, it creates a bit of a gray area. So, Christine, as Curtis says, we don't want it on frozen ground. But as you mentioned, sometimes we do get a window, perhaps early in the winter, where the ground is not frozen yet. The weather warms up a little. The ground can carry the equipment, and we do go. What do we need to keep in mind to make sure that we're making the right decisions in a winter application?
Yeah, so my rule of thumb is if you can apply it and incorporate it the same day, good to go.
Okay.
Because the definition between frozen and the trouble with calendar is there's a big difference in weather in Windsor compared to Sudbury or Thunder Bay.
Yes.
Huge difference. So if it's, you get those days where it's frozen in the morning, it thaws out during the day a bit, it freezes at night again. You get that in the fall and in the spring. And if we can apply it and we can incorporate it that same day and not risk the runoff, then that's a common sense approach in my mind.
Okay. Glenn, do you have the argument over not spreading on snow? Because that's a thing in Ontario that we throw hands over.
Well, we have different rules based on the size of your livestock operation. For example, all permitted farms, which are farms of 1,000 animal units or larger, are not permitted to do winter manure application on snow or frozen ground. And so that's why they build satellite ponds and other places that they can run with if you have a particularly bad fall and we can't get manure applied. And then some of ours are watershed specific. There's one watershed in the state that has a ban between December 15th and March 1st on manure application. And then the biggest thing I would emphasize on that is that it's a judgment call, but regulators and people who enforce rules have really cracked down quite a bit in the last 3 to 5 years. And it really isn't worth the risk anymore to run out there and land apply if conditions aren't really suitable, as Christine said, where you can get it incorporated pretty rapidly. You're way further ahead to call a dairy farmer and say, hey, I've got to move a couple loads of manure down to your place and do that, and then and buy yourself time if you were one of those who could not get their manure applied in the fall. Now, we've had a phenomenal fall. There won't be very many good excuses a person could come up with for having to apply manure in the winter. But I just know that we do not freeze solid and stay frozen. We warm back up, and then we get some moisture. So anything you land apply in the wintertime and don't get worked in, just as sure it's going to reach a watershed or a ditch water someplace, and then the agency people will write you up for that. So.
Absolutely. All right. I'd like to point out, Dr. Dave is very glad that when we say fall field work, it doesn't just talk about tillage. And you're right, Dr. Dave. We're going to talk about whatever. Now, we could, of course, do a whole thing on fall weed control. We've already done that. So that's why we're talking about tillage passes, manure passes, maybe some cover cropping, all those things. Okay, everybody? Producer Jay, if you would, let's queue up. We did mention Christine, you mentioned about, when the nutrients will be available. And this is something we can all talk about. When we're talking about manure especially, but also cover crops. But frankly, even just fall applied fertilizer in general, we have to think about when that fertilizer is going to be available and what loss it might be subject to. I've pulled a clip here from, I want to say this is like 2013. It's very old and I love it. It's with Dr. Jeff Shano talking about mineralization and what can we expect in the years after manure application. Producer Jay, if you would.
In some manures, and I'm thinking here specifically about cattle manure, nearly all of the nitrogen contained in solid cattle manure is in the organic form. And in order for plants to be able to use nitrogen in manure, it needs to be converted into an inorganic form, ammonium and nitrate that roots can absorb. So what we rely on when manure is applied to a field is microorganisms to break down that organic material and release that nutrient like nitrogen, like sulfur, into the available forms. And manures are different in terms of how they behave in this release of available nitrogen and sulfur and other nutrients in this process we call mineralization. Some manures, for example, manures from pens where a lot of straw bedding or wood chips have been used, there's a lot of carbon associated with the fecal material, with the urine. And what that means is that the microbes that are doing the mineralization, the breakdown, have to chew through a lot of carbon to get to the nitrogen and release it. And so consequently we see with some penning manures actually quite low availability of nitrogen in the year of application. Although those manures can supply a lot of phosphorus, low nitrogen availability may limit growth, such that, for example, there may be some benefit from supplementing that manure nitrogen with some commercial fertilizer nitrogen as well. Other manures, on the other hand, and I'm thinking here of liquid manures like liquid swine manure, have more predictable release of available nitrogen. For example, 20 to 30% of the organic nitrogen in liquid manure from swine would be rendered available, plant available in the year of application. With cattle manure, we've seen it as low as only 8 or 10% availability. It can be higher, even as high as 50% if you were dealing mainly with fecal material.
Our sponsors tonight are RealAg on the Weekend, Farming Forward, and the Wheat School. From varietal advancements, protein and yield management, precision farming, and onto marketing, Real Agriculture's Wheat School is a video series that tackles every facet of the wheat growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Wheat School is made possible through Syngenta Canada, C&M Seeds, and Alberta Grains. Learn more at wheatschool.com.
I'll be honest, I don't think Jeff is aged at all. I should let him know that. I should send him that link. Okay. He was on just a couple of weeks ago. I should have played it. Okay. So Kevin shares, if you think of manure as fertilizer, it has to be applied during the growing season. If you're just disposing of it, then you need a commercial disposal permit. That's the argument. He says that they don't have manure spreading after November 1. He's in the Fraser Valley, so they have high rainfall, obviously. But their ground, Kevin, I'm doubtful that your ground freezes. So maybe more similar to some of our friends further south where it might get cold, but it's not going to freeze hard. Like we love in Manitoba, where we get that lovely, fully frozen soil most years, right, Curtis?
Yep.
Which brings me to one of my questions. I do want to talk about the mineralization question, if I can speak. But I also want to talk about anhydrous ammonia in the fall. And it's not something that I see a ton of here. Glenn, would love to hear your thoughts too, but still a relatively common practice for parts of the prairies, Manitoba being one of them. What do we need to know about anhydrous ammonia going down in the fall? What is too warm? Is there such thing as too late? What do we need to know?
Yeah, there's still a following of producers that use anhydrous ammonia quite a bit in Manitoba, especially if they can band it in the fall. It's still a fairly common standard practice. The main rule of thumb is to try and have those applications go on after the soils have cooled to about 10 degrees Celsius. Cooler is better, but 10 I think is kind of the threshold that we go with there to try and ensure that if the soils are cool enough, that delays the conversion from ammonia to ammonium and nitrate. And then following 4R principles, if you're banding effectively so that you're not having much of the gas escape, following soil tests, and possibly using inhibitors, although I don't think we've had much success so far of people putting inhibitors in with their anhydrous. I think it can be done, but I don't think there's many that are doing it because I think there's issues with corrosion of the tanks and all those other things there too. So that's still kind of a novel approach.
Still scares the bejesus out of me, Curtis. I won't lie.
Yep.
It's
well,
dangerous
anhydrous is nasty to work with too. So yeah.
Yes. Glenn, is anhydrous ammonia used in your area at all?
Kind of sparingly. Again, with our heavier clays, it's pretty hard to seal the soil to capture the anhydrous. Now it's used more as a side dress after corn has emerged in June, and the yield from anhydrous, of course, is better than what you can get with your 28% UAN. So again, in the fall we would suggest not using it until you get soil temperatures that are cold enough to inhibit that bacterial conversion, as was mentioned, and again, not common, but with farmers with sandier soils, they probably have used it for many, many years and will continue, I think. And it's the cheapest source of nitrogen that we usually see as well.
Christine, I'm kind of surprised that we don't see it more in Ontario because I see a lot of field passes in the fall. And I feel like, why wouldn't you? But we are prone to losing all of our nitrogen over the winter, are we not?
Yeah, I'm not aware of, and even in side dress, I'm not aware of that much anhydrous being applied. It's far more 28% that I'm aware of. Yeah, we have every winter is different, but if you use last year and a couple of the past years, we get a lot of those. It's cold and then it's warm again, and then it's cold and then it's warm again, and the minus 10 degree temperatures that Curtis and Glenn were talking about, that's great to keep it as ammonia and not convert it to nitrate. But when we get those mild spells, we're going to get some of that conversion happening, and that's, I think, when the potential for losses is the highest. But the other thing that Shuno, I can't remember, Jeff. What he was mentioning about that mineralization, and where we've got that solid manure, there's a real benefit of having that solid manure applied in the fall so that you've got more of that time during the early spring season for the microbes to work on it. So it's that mineralization and those taking advantage of those warm periods sometimes does have an advantage for different types of manure nitrogen.
Now, okay, Glenn, you've sent a couple really cool pictures with different manure application technologies. But I want to go straight to the one that I had to ask what the heck this was and if it was from Mad Max. So producer Jay, if you could get to that slide maybe first. And Christine, as I understand, you might have some experience with this as well. But what am I looking at here, Glenn?
Well, you're looking at something that's relatively new. It's only really came up in the market in the last 3-4 year period of time. And that's a 360 rain is the term that they use for that. And essentially it's an self-propelled applicator that's designed to run 24/7 as long as the weather is suitable for manure application. This little machine will putter along at a half-mile an hour or so, putting down whatever rate you set, probably somewhere around 10,000 gallons per acre, could be 11, 12, could be a little less. And as it goes down the field and unrolls its hose, it puts manure out the outer hoses on this machine, and then it backs up and reverses right down the same rows of corn it came down. And when it's in reverse, like it is now, it's putting manure out in the rows where the wheels traveled. So it's just something that we see this with a lot of larger dairies are looking at these because, again, you can get a lot of liquid applied, and then it can run. They'll maybe make as many as 6 or 7 passes in a summer over the very same cornfield. So again, it has to be a low nutrient water, and I've seen them also have 28 injectors in the hose back at the manure source, where they're actually putting nitrogen in this hose to go along with the manure.
Christine, have you got to play with one of these? They look pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a couple of them that are going into Ontario farms, and so we've had the opportunity to see how they work and how they're being installed. So this is something where it covers approximately on one farm 300-ish acres over the season. So it goes, like Glenn said, the same rows several times during the year. Where I see this as a really nice opportunity is we keep talking about taking the nutrients from manure to fields further away from the farm or further away from the livestock storage. And so if we can separate out the solids, then of course we're left with the liquids. And it's expensive to take liquids a far distance. So in a situation like this, you can have the liquids going on close to the fields, close to the storage during the summer, when sometimes we need the rain really badly. So we're not only getting the nutrient water, but also the water. And then we can take those solids to fields further away.
So what then, though, is the nutrient breakdown between the solid portion and the liquid portion?
On regular dairy manure, you're usually talking about 97, 98% liquids. When they're running this, they actually dilute that even further. Sometimes they'll
interesting.
They'll divert it with maybe 2 gallons of water, or perhaps lot runoff water per 1 gallon of manure.
So now, and this is going to apply rates that you choose based on, well, yes, nutrients that you want, but also likely what's actually capacity, right? Because it's okay. Yeah.
And it doesn't, the volume isn't all that much. I mean, these machines run perhaps 200, 300 gallons a minute. If you're used to a commercial manure applicator who can pump 2,000 gallons a minute or 3,000 gallons a minute, these look slow. And but when the corn is tall in July and August, and this thing just putters right through it, just like it did back when the corn was short, like this one is, they're pretty impressive.
Curtis, when you see that, sorry, go ahead, Christine.
And it also has some adaptation for forages, because the limitation of this machine is hills. So once you get to slopes that are more than 5-ish, 6%, you're going to have some problems. But and potentially with water running down the hill faster than depending on the
can absorb, right?
But I think it also has some application in forages that also need a lot of water during those summer months.
Okay.
Yeah, I watched one running the other day in a field of triticale. And again, we've been so dry this summer that these machines have continued running all through October and into November. And we really don't have enough rain to forecast right now that I could see these things running to December at the current rate we're going.
Right. Okay, so this also makes me think about the compaction question. So Curtis, and that's one of the things I do want to touch on is fall compaction. So this is a machine that obviously could run later into the season, but could go spring, it could run all summer. Thinking about something like this and thinking about what a machine like this can do, from the compaction perspective, especially when we think about, manure application, etc. That's what I think of when I see something like this, is just how little of a compaction footprint this potentially has.
Yeah, like I should ask before we go too far, like how big or how much would that
Yeah.
weigh? Something like that.
Well, you've probably got, it's a 3-inch hose. So when it's rolled up and full of manure, probably have a 1/4 mile hose on there, or a little bit more. So it it would be substantial. But I've watched it run.
It's not carrying a bunch of liquid in it. Then it's just it's getting piped through it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The only liquid it's carrying is the fuel in the diesel tank.
Okay. So it would be lighter than most tractors or combines or something like that. Then, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Huh.
But
Okay.
that's good to know, because it's the worst one for us for compaction in our part of the world are the grain carts. With when you start carrying 700, 800, 1,500 bushels of grain when they're full, or maybe more for some of them there. That's a tremendous amount of weight, and if the soils are moist, that's when they're the most susceptible to compaction. So if they're close to or in around that field capacity range, whatever that is for your soil, that's when they're probably most likely to cause the most amount of compaction. So if you've got a dry fall, then that's maybe a good time to try and avoid compaction. But if you got a wet fall, then that's where you have to start deciding, are we better off to defer till spring, or are we going to just have more of the same problems in spring? How good's your crystal ball?
Okay. Yeah, exactly. And do you like fixing ruts? That's always a really great question. Do you like to? Okay, so Reynold wants to know, this is not a foliar app. It's on the ground between the rows. Is that what we're looking at? Yes. Okay.
Yeah. If you were standing beside it, it'd look a lot like Y drops are on on a high boy.
Yeah. Okay. And how can you control the odor from mid-season warm weather surface application of manure? Good question, Mark.
Usually in these instances, the corn is, once it gets up there about 1 foot or 1.5 foot, the odor issue gets to be pretty minimal at that point.
Okay. Also, Ray is reminding me that a buggy is a grain cart. So in Eastern Ontario, that's yes, Ray. I know what a grain cart is. What a buggy is.
Good thing he's bilingual.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank
you for translating.
on the straight and narrow. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for translating.
Thanks, Ray.
Okay, so now we've also got some producer, if you would. We've got, I think it's the one before this. We've got some other application photos with the. Not this one, but actually we could talk about this one. Yeah, what's happening here, Glenn? What was this trial working on?
This is one of our corn side dress trials that we were working on. I had a lot of neighbors come over and watch. And what we're essentially doing here is we're knifing manure in using a coulter till toolbar, and these are basically 12-row units, and we drag a hose in the field, and you can drag a hose across corn comfortably through the V3 and up through the V4 stage, and side dress the corn with the same nitrogen you would have put on with a 28 applicator or an anhydrous ammonia bar.
Okay. And that's how you know you're doing something fun, is when everybody wants to know what the heck you're doing out there. That's usually a good indication. Okay. Jason's got a good question, and actually let's hop to that for just a moment. But Mark would like to add, my rich neighbors with fancy cottages in our proximity have very sensitive noses. So perhaps in summer applications may not be the best for Mark and his sensitive neighbors. Jason Vought's got a great question on talking tillage, what type to use and when, high-speed disc versus others. This is to talk managing residue. So Curtis, I'll go to you with this one. Certainly with a shift to more corn acres in Manitoba, you've got some residue issues. We always have them with our wheat and lots of biomass. So what have you been working on as far as fall tillage and the actual type of tool we can choose?
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for the question there. I'll take a stab at it here. You know, we tillage is one of these things that it's like a lifestyle type of question, and I'm not here to judge or to say one way's better than the other or anything like that, but it is a personal choice on these things, and you need to understand what the conditions are and what soils or what fields you're dealing with when you go into this, because you're going to get different outcomes in different years and different outcomes on different fields. So if you've got heavier land and it's a wet year, then obviously tillage to manage those high residues is probably a good thing and a necessary thing to avoid problems in the spring. If it's a dry year, and particularly on lighter, more erodible soils, then it's much easier to say steer clear or minimize how much tillage you want to do, so that you don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to have soils prone to wind, water, and other forms of erosion and that. The tricky part and the hardest part is when you've got variable landscapes and unpredictable weather, like we've had wet springs, dry falls, or everything else in between. And you've got these fields where you've got hilltops that, have erosion or tend to be droughty with not a lot of residue cover on it, along with adjacent to them depressions that can be wet and difficult to manage without tillage. So it becomes a difficult thing, and it's maybe where you start having to think like a precision ag approach to something like this. Maybe you do till the field, but only certain parts of the field, or you use certain types of tillage equipment, but you got to, use them a certain way, and maybe not for the entire field. So it's a very general answer at a very specific question, but I think that's the place to get the ball rolling.
We often use the "it depends" here on this show,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to throw out there, it depends on what you have in the shed. Did you buy a fancy new tillage unit? That's probably what you're going to use. So I will just throw that one out there too.
To get on a bit of a soapbox on this too, though, is just because it's new and just because it may have may have been marketed or kind of sold as a conservation tillage unit doesn't necessarily mean it is a conservation tillage unit. I'm working on a project right now with Dr. David Lobb, who many probably know from Ontario and he likes to get on, rightly so. I better not get myself in trouble, but he often will get on the soapbox and say that some of these vertical till units or things like that, in terms of measuring tillage erosion or how much they can drag soil, especially down slope if you're dealing with a hilly landscape, these can be just as erosive as a moldboard plow. And I know that shocks a lot of people, but it's in how they're measured and how much soil is actually being moved. So so it is something to at least hopefully create a pause and ponder and ask yourself if this is the best approach to do this, short term and long term.
Dr. David Lobb was one of my soils teachers. I learned from some of the best. So
Yes.
I can hear him in my head talking
Yeah.
about how much of that earth is getting moved on those tillage passes. So there you go. It is of course a really good thought process to go through, is to think about what are you trying to accomplish, what tools you have. But I like that idea of potentially, using more prescriptive type approaches to different or variable fields, which I really like. And Jason agrees. So there you go. We're making everybody happy. Okay, we've got a couple of good questions that have come in here on this question of mineralization, this question of when nutrients are available, and also holding nutrients where we want them to be. So Mark asks, what is the best cover crop species? So Christine, maybe we'll go to you first on this one. Cover crop species to carry the manure nutrients into spring planted crop and save it from being lost through the winter. So if I've put manure on after the wheat comes off, I'm going to grow a cover crop, does the species matter? And if so, What should I choose?
There's a lot of opinions, and people have preferences, of course. I like what somebody said earlier in the chat: keep it simple. So, and I guess if you're putting manure on, that keeping it simple is if you're putting manure on, you've got two things that you're trying to accomplish at the same time or close to the same time. So I like oats, or if it's too late for oats, cereal rye, because you've got nutrients that are being taken up in that fall season. And if it doesn't go to head, if you don't have too much cellulose or lignans, then it's going to break down fairly quickly in the springtime and not hold the nutrients too long. The hard part, though, is if most of the time people are applying manure for a corn crop, and if they're applying it for that corn crop, to try and get it so that those nutrients are there and available to that corn crop when that corn crop needs it the most. And so I think part of managing the cover crops, or managing the manure timing with the cover crop timing, is what is the composition of the manure, and what is the nitrogen to the ammonia to organic nitrogen ratio, what is the carbon to nitrogen ratio, to give us a little bit of an idea of how quickly are some of those nutrients potentially going to become available, either early spring, late spring, or sometimes late summer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to pause it there for just a moment. We're going to have our last read of the night, and then we're going to talk a little bit about strip tillage and a few other questions that have come in. So Producer Jay, if you would.
Our sponsors tonight are the Wheat School, RealAg on the Weekend, and Farming Forward. Farming Forward is a new video series brought to you by the Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. Sharpen your soil health expertise with cover cropping, nitrogen management, and advanced grazing. Visit realagriculture.com/category/farming-forward for more.
Or just go to YouTube. You can find it there. Super easy peasy. Okay. All right. So I like the keep it simple. The question of anything that goes on the year before, so whether that's manure in season, manure in the fall, a cover crop that grows and then is terminated, or fall applied fertilizer, counting on it for the next season always becomes a bit of an unknown. Glen, I'll go to you. Is there a lot of strip till happening in your area? Has that caught on?
Yeah, there is some strip till. There's quite a bit in the western edge, Van Wert County. They used to have a farm program there called Farm Focus many years ago. They did a lot of research on that. And a lot of people who participated in that still do the strip tillage in the fall. You see that pretty commonly done in soybean stubble. Whether that's, they would be the only ones that could tell you whether it was a justifiable thing to do, and they continue to do it. So it must be. But I know in the research results that they had done at that time, it didn't seem to be worth the extra pass to do that. So,
yeah. So those who were part of it have continued, but it hasn't necessarily spread beyond those that did it.
I would say that if you looked at fields this fall and you drove them, I'd say less than 1 out of 25 would show any type of strip tillage.
Okay. Curtis, what about in Manitoba? I know that there are certainly some that are doing strip tillage, but has it grown in popularity?
There's some, certainly right around where I live on the sands. It seems to be a viable thing to do there to, get kind of get the best of both worlds, maintain that cover in around the strip, but then have that strip to darken up and warm up in the spring. So those that are doing it seem to be happy with it, but as far as how many have tried it, I can't say for sure, but it does show some promise. Yeah,
certainly. Yeah, I mean, really good point about depending on the soil type, it might be that very nice happy medium in between full tillage and zero till. But I'm Christine, I don't know, do you have any experience with strip tillage as far as any of the work that you've been doing as well?
I don't have as much experience with strip till. I know that some of my counterparts have been doing a lot of work with strip till. I'm excited as they fine-tune the systems to work better in different soil types to be able to put manure down ahead of planting and then planting right into the strip, whether it's in the fall or in the spring. And some of that fine-tuning is happening, but I'm not sure how many people are actually doing it yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Glenn, Ray DeBanco's got a question for you and says manure as side dress. So if we're going to think about it from that perspective with that very cool machine, how do you determine or judge availability in season of the nitrogen component, especially? Certainly we know in the fall we need some of sort of that weathering, but how about in season? How much can we count on?
Well, we look primarily when we're looking at swine manure, we look at the ammonia nitrogen portion that's in the manure test to get back. And then swine manure, about 95% of our nitrogen is in the ammonium form, which is readily available to the plant. So if we can put that on when a plant wants it, it will be thrilled to death and it'll use it. So on dairy manure, you're a lower total pounds of nitrogen in 1,000 gallons, and you're also lower on the ammonium nitrogen, although that's come up in recent years as they've gotten away from the organic bedding and gone more to the sand bedding. We see the ammonia nitrogen portion coming up. But we look primarily on swine manure, we look at how much ammonium nitrogen per 1,000 pounds, and we put that on at the same rate we would put on our commercial fertilizer. And usually we'll out yield our commercial fertilizer with that.
Mm-hmm. Manure is magic. What can I say? It's brown gold, everybody. It's brown gold. Curtis just wishes there was more of it on the fields that you get to work on. There's some, right? Okay.
Yep.
Switching gears a little bit to think about phosphorus. When I think of losses, phosphorus, of course, is not the first one we think of, but certainly I think about runoff in the spring over frozen ground being a risk. Potentially, if we've got some phosphorus losses. When is there still, I guess is my question, broadcasting phosphorus? Are we still doing that in Manitoba, or have we moved past that practice? Where does that fit into the fall versus spring discussion?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Very little broadcasting of phosphorus, I think. I'm trying to think of a scenario where you might be doing that. It's pretty rare
Okay.
on something like that for that very reason, that it's just too much of a risk of runoff, and agronomically you're not getting the phosphorus where you need it. So not much of that happening, I don't think.
Christine, from the phosphorus perspective with manure, I think about hog manure, certainly. How are we managing the runoff risk component when we think about manure?
Mostly with the recommendation to incorporate it as quickly as possible. So with fall application, that's sometimes weather dependent. We talked about that earlier. This time of year, conditions that we've got right now, it's pretty easy to apply it and incorporate it, or even to inject it. But on years where you've got really wet soils, sometimes you're doing more smearing damage and increasing the potential for water runoff and nutrient runoff. It's better to surface apply it and then incorporate it as quickly as possible to get that better incorporation. But definitely incorporation to reduce, because it's the 4 R's. Ideally, we would put it on when you've got the best conditions, summer conditions, spring conditions. But where we're putting manure on after corn harvest, best thing we can do is incorporate it, and that means tillage.
Yep. Then one question that I sort of add to that, thinking about, let's say I've already got a growing cover crop, Christine. Can I add manure on top of it and not work it in? Or do I still run the risk of losses or higher losses just because I have a growing crop there doesn't necessarily negate that, or does it?
A growing crop helps. There's not going to be any situation that it's perfect, because if you get a 2-inch rainstorm in a period of a couple hours, it doesn't matter how much forage cover, how much residue you've got, you're going to still get some runoff. So yeah, if you've got a forage crop or cereal rye or a cover crop, yeah, if you can incorporate it. And we were talking earlier about odors, but if we can get that manure laying close to the surface and not small droplets with a high splash plate, that's also going to help with not just odor, but also placement of that manure into that cover crop.
Okay.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Slopes.
There's a question here about limestone application. Glenn, I don't know if you want to answer this one. In a no-till situation, will a cover crop be sufficient to prevent limestone application from eroding? How do we keep our lime where we need it, Glenn?
I wouldn't know that one very well. I know it
No?
takes,
Okay.
takes about 6 months for that line to be activated to do what you want it to do. But the no-till guys have the same issue that many of the rest of our guys are having, and that is we've gotten away from deep tillage. So we love our turbo tills, and that, of course, that releases corn stalks to blow in the ditches and stuff. But I think also there's been some testing done over the last few years by some studies, and we have a tendency to concentrate our nutrients at much higher rates in that upper inch of the soil than we did years and years ago when we deep tilled or plowed and things like that. And by leaving all those nutrients up there, even though there's a lot of corn roots and a lot of soybean roots that like those shallow nutrients, it also makes us susceptible to loss through rainfall, heavy rains, soil erosion, things like that. So we all look at Lake Erie, and we're all trying to figure out what are the 2 or 3 key things that we need to change to improve our water quality. I think someday we'll find out that congregating these nutrients in the upper portion of the field is probably one of the factors that's increased our dissolved reactive phosphorus loss. So,
okay. I don't know anything about lime beyond apparently, I've done enough shows about pH that I know it's important. But that's why I ask you guys, because I literally have no clue. I just see it out in the piles. And so it's a good question though, because I've seen it applied now several times, and I do sort of question. I'm like, do you have to work it in? Should you work it in? I feel like you should. But anyway, this is why I love things like this, is because I get to learn as well with all y'all, because some of these things are just things I would never think of. Anyway, Glenn, a really good point though on the environmental aspect. Maybe that's where we'll leave it for tonight as we're out of time. Curtis, when we're thinking about our fall field work and thinking about the environmental implications of what we're doing, how do we work that into the decisions that we make as to, let's say, specifically with tillage, how much is too much? Can we keep these things sort of in check in the back of our mind and still accomplish what we need to get done?
Yeah, I think just like how you said it, you think about it before you do it, not just, oh, I'm doing it because I've always done it this way or whatever. Just consciously think about what you're up against in terms of the moisture conditions, the amount of residue that's there, how much, if any, do you need to till, how much residue are you going to remove by doing that, and what are the implications of doing it in the fall versus maybe waiting and doing it in the spring.
Mm-hmm. And Christine, you are the manure guru, of course. So we always have to think about the environment every time we're applying this brown gold. So specifically in the fall, though, what words of advice would you have as far as the environmental implications for the fall?
Get it on as early as you can and incorporate it where possible, or as soon as possible after application. Take a manure analysis so that you know what you're working with, so that you can account especially the phosphorus and the potash, and even get a little bit of a better idea with the nitrogen content. And then potentially think about, if it's in corn, maybe doing some side dress nitrogen tests to kind of get an idea of what are we getting the following spring based on weather conditions and moisture conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Excellent point. Always test. All right. Thank you all for joining me tonight. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you to everyone in the comments as well for your questions, your comments. To Glenn, Christine, and Curtis, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for sharing your time with me.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay. We don't have a show next week, actually. So it will be the week after. Please come on back Mondays, of course, 8 p.m. Eastern. But next week we do not have a show. And I am planning, everybody, all the way through to the Christmas break. I've got a couple great ideas in there, but I have a couple of gaps. So if you've got ideas for shows or for people that you'd like to see on the show, get in touch with me, lsmith@realagriculture.com. I've got a few holes I'd like to fill, and I always love your feedback. You always come up with some great ideas. So send them on in. And of course, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists, get those CEU credits. And while you're there, sign up for our email. We'll remind you the day of to join us in the evening as well. Thank you to all our show sponsors. Thanks to producer Jay, and thanks to all my guests. Have a great week. Cheers, everybody.